Okay, here we are in chapter 23, the urogenital system infections. In our face-to-face class, this is the one that I've actually had parents request that their children come in and watch to make them realize how scary some of the sexually transmitted illnesses can be. So if you haven't already looked through the slides, there are some fairly graphic images because this is dealing with the reproductive system. So just be aware of that when you're viewing the slides at home if there's anybody you don't want viewing such slides. We're looking at the urinary and genital systems together because in bodies with a penis, the exit and entry portals are the same through the urethra, so they're interconnected. And in other bodied people, the vagina and the urethra are right next to each other, and so the flora sometimes mix, and that's why we put them together in this one chapter. This image is showing a urine sample. Certainly urinary tract infections in everyone can be detected in a urine sample, but also some illnesses of the reproductive system can be detected. When we could do so safely, I volunteered at the Planned Parenthood of Northern California Clinic in Eureka. And my job there was to do the rapid HIV test, which is a finger stick test, and also make sure that the clients left urine samples, and from the urine sample, the labs could test for gonorrhea and chlamydia. Other of the infections required a blood sample, and we'll go into why later in this chapter. So this culture was prepared from a person that had a urinary tract infection. And it's a specialized agar so that it is selective for particular microbes to show up and differential. We see some that grew with this dark navy color and others that had this burgundy color in the background. So there was a mixture of microbes present in that sample. The 2 slide this time, anatomy and physiology, the urinary system shown here, for the kidneys, connected via the ureters to the bladder, and of course the blood supply for that. Most of the urinary tract infections that people experience, they find them or feel them when they are either just in the urethra or in the bladder. However, if the microbes migrate further up, the ureters can become inflamed, which would cause pelvic pain, and the kidneys can become involved, which causes back pain. A close-up of the kidney, which is one of our filtration organs. If we look at these lobes within the kidney, the actual filtration unit is the glomerulus. More than one is glomeruli. And so that is where we filter the blood in the kidney, removing the water and the dissolved compounds, and then the waste is excreted as urine. Side view of 2 different reproductive tracts. In bodies that have a penis, as I mentioned, the urine and the reproductive fluids exit through the penis, and the prostate gland contributes to those secretions. Whereas in bodies that have a vagina, we've got the urinary opening, the urethra, and the reproductive opening, the vagina, quite close to each other. And of course, both bodies have the anus. And depending on the types of sexual activity, there is that risk of urinary tract infections from anal sex and the mixing of the flora between the different systems in these types of bodies. This is depicting a dipstick test for urine and could be used looking at a urinary tract infection or just to see the chemical quality of the urine. And so I have some notes here that the pH should be slightly acidic, should be around 6.5-ish, so a low pH. If there is an infection present, a urinary tract infection that is bacterial in nature, they will also pick up nitrite, which is NO2. And we look for nitrite because microbes that can reduce nitrate, which is NO3, to nitrite should not be present in the urine. So if they're metabolizing, they will produce that nitrite, and that is an indication that there are bacteria in the urine. The other thing that the dipstick test looks for, white blood cells, because we know that monocytes and other white blood cells are that initial non-specific response to an infection. And there are also the T and B cells, which are white blood cells that could show up in the presence of an infection. And if red blood cells are present, that is indicating that the infection has progressed so that tissue damage is being caused. And all of that can be done with a quick little dipstick in the urine. Sorry, I've got an itchy eye here. This slide is showing Leptospira interrogans. What a crazy name. It causes leptospirosis. We contract this from contaminated water, primarily from water contaminated with urine from animals that have been infected with the Leptospira. This can be a very serious disease in our pets, so that vaccination against leptospirosis is very important. And so this is an electron micrograph. It's very spiral shaped, and this is a dark field view where the background is stained and the bacteria seem like they're glowing. And that is 1 micron, so these are very long bacteria. The size bar is also on this one. So UTI is the abbreviation for urinary tract infection, and cystitis is specifically a bladder infection. And in bodies with vaginas, so that the urethra and the reproductive opening are separate, cystitis can be quite common for a couple of reasons. The urethra is very short, so any microbes on that opening don't have very far to go to reach the bladder. So holding one's urine and not flushing the bladder and urethra often enough can contribute to that. After defecation, wiping from back to front can spread fecal bacteria toward the urethra, and those fecal bacteria, while are perfectly fine in the intestinal tract and cause us no difficulty, they do not belong in the urinary tract, and they can colonize and cause irritation and tissue damage. And sexual activity can also, just the friction and the movement can spread microbes from one opening to another, and that is another way that cystitis could be caused. This table here is listing the bacterial infections of the urinary tract, similar to the tables we saw in chapters 21 and 22. And I just made the Word/PDF document of the organisms that you would be responsible on the next exam. So the disease is in the table, and it'll be your job to fill in the pathogen, the signs and symptoms, transmission, diagnostic, and antimicrobial drugs. You can see for cystitis, there is a whole host of bacteria. You don't have to know all of them. If you can name me one, you're in good shape. But if we look at them, the E. coli, Enterococcus faecalis are both Enterobacteriaceae, those coliform bacteria that are found, E. coli is anyway, found in the colon. Enterococcus is actually a gram-positive coccus, but faecalis tells you it's part of fecal matter. And there are some other microbes that can be on the skin and elsewhere in the body that if they end up in the bladder, cause problems. Other diseases have a few organisms, and again, if you can list me at least one of them with the appropriate signs and symptoms, etc., you will be in fine shape. This is a micrograph of a vaginal smear. So when a person would go and get a pap smear, they have sort of a bottle brush tool that goes in and collects vaginal cells and cells from the cervix. What they're looking for would be the presence of any microbes of any sort that are not part of the normal flora, or any misshapen cells. In this case, they are looking at clue cells. This is the clue cell. These two are normal epithelial cells from the vagina. This cell has so many bacteria on it that you can't even see the cell. That is your clue that the microbe Chlamydia trachomatis is present. There would be chemical tests to confirm this, but a very quick smear on a microscope slide could indicate to the patient while they're in the clinic that there is an abnormal smear. This doesn't indicate cancer because these are vaginal epithelial cells and these are bacteria. But it's Chlamydia trachomatis, one of the most common sexually transmitted illnesses. Neisseria gonorrhea, it's very nice when the organism tells you the disease it causes. It is a gram-negative coccus, and so this is a stain showing the little cocci that are present on the surface of urethral discharge. Those are urethral cells. So they have both the symptoms on a penis with discharge. The lesions are not associated with gonorrhea, as the words here indicate. It's a co-infection with a different sexually transmitted illness. We'll get to them, but it's probably either herpes or something called a chancroid. And then this person has discharge from the cervix. Externally, there may not be any symptoms. People with vaginas often show no symptoms until very late in the progression of the disease. That's why it's really important for anyone who is thinking of or is sexually active, not only to practice safer sex and use condoms, but also to get tested at least once a year, preferably more often, just to make sure that you are healthy and well, because you could have an illness and have no signs or symptoms and pass it on to a partner. And it's a reminder that while we are talking about sexually transmitted illnesses, just like any other illness, nice, pretty, handsome, healthy, clean people get diseases, including sexually transmitted illnesses. So it's important to make sure that your sexual health is paid attention to as much as your mental health and the rest of your physical health. This is showing the chlamydia again. Inclusion bodies. It's being grown in culture. The inclusion bodies is where there's multiple cells that have been walled off during an infection. And on the right is showing a person where the chlamydia has affected their immune system. They have lymphogranuloma venereum, swollen lymph nodes. So the obligate intracellular pathogen of the Chlamydia trachomatis is replicating and causing that swelling in the groin. And this happens to be an individual with a penis, but you could also have that same swelling in the groin because all bodies have those lymph nodes in the groin area. Again, we show the worst case scenarios. This is syphilis. Primary syphilis is the initial sore that shows up at the site of infection, and that's typically on the genitals, no matter what type of genitals. It's called a hard chancre. It's sore because it's not squishy and it's not necessarily painful. On a penis, it may be more noticeable because it's easier to see that genital, although the underside might be more difficult for an individual to see. On persons with a vulva, it might be much more difficult to notice the initial lesion. It's called primary because it's the first stage. That chancre will go away, of course, with treatment, but it will also go away without treatment. So if a person misses seeing that sore, they won't ever know they had infection. Or if they see the sore and it goes away, feel that they've been cured of that infection. However, unless they've been treated, then we show up with secondary syphilis, which is this rash that typically shows up on the hands, and it's because of capillary leakage under the surface. So now this organism has left the genital region and is now systemic. And again, that rash will go away. And many people would think that whatever that rash was went away. They're cured. Not a lot of people would know to associate a weird rash on the palms of their hand with a sexually transmitted illness. And the third image is tertiary syphilis. So when the organisms are reactivated yet again, they cause these lesions called gummas. This one's on the person's nose. They can show up anywhere on the body, and they can be bone deep, causing lesions through the epidermis, the dermis, the subtissue, all the way down to bone. And it can also affect the nervous system, can infect the brain and cause neurological effects, including insanity. Syphilis is treatable. There are antibiotics. This is a bacterium that can treat it. The earlier it's treated, the more likely the person is not to suffer any long-term effects from it. But if it goes to tertiary syphilis, it is much, much more difficult to treat. I've written here the Tuskegee experiment to remind me to mention that to you. The Tuskegee experiment was a decades-long experiment carried out in the United States in the South, Tuskegee, Alabama, where the African American population was experimented on without their consent. They were told that they had bad blood, which is not exactly a lie. They had microbes circulating in their blood, but it's also not the truth. They were not told that this was a treatable infection. They were not given any sort of medication that could have alleviated the signs and symptoms or cured them of it as years went by and cures were available. The experiment was really just to see what happens in this population if you do not do any treatment whatsoever for syphilis. And so it affected not only the initial participants, but their descendants as well, because they pass it on to partners. During pregnancy, syphilis can cause miscarriages and various deformations and delays in development in the fetuses, and it was stopped sometime in the 1970s. So they highly recommend, if you are at all interested in medical ethics, that you look up the Tuskegee experiment. This is a dark field micrograph of syphilis. It is a spirochete or spiral-shaped bacterium. It's a different stain called a silver stain. Syphilis is one of those bacteria that are really difficult, if not impossible, to grow in the lab. Can't just get a liquid culture of syphilis and streak it on the agar and get colonies. It won't grow. They're very picky, and we have yet to be able to cultivate them at all in the lab. We can see them, we can visualize them, we can tell they're present in every case of a person with syphilis, but we cannot cultivate them. This is a disease called chancroid. The lesion on the genitals caused by syphilis is a chancre. This disease is chancroid. It causes a soft chancre, so pus-filled there on the surface of the genitals. It is caused by a gram-negative microbe called Haemophilus ducreyi. And here it's in a gram-stained culture of rabbit blood. Very picky organism. Again, can't really grow it on the surface of agar, so it's cultured in animal blood to be able to see the microbe. It can also, because it is bacterial, be cured with antibiotics. And again, though, if you miss the sore on the genitals, it might spread to deeper tissues before it gets treated. The giant table of bacterial infections of the reproductive tract, which I again have reproduced that in a PDF format and saved it as Chapter 23 study guide and put that in the module along with this lecture and the slides without my narration and the chapter of the book. Moving to viral infections, we're seeing herpes virus again. We saw herpes virus with infections of the skin because herpes simplex 1 is the form of herpes virus that is more common in oral herpes. And herpes simplex virus 2 is the herpes virus that is more common in genital herpes. However, through oral sex, the oral herpes HSV1 can end up on the genitals, and the genital herpes HSV2 can end up in the oral mucosa. Because it is a herpes virus, it does not ever go away. It might go into remission, and a person may rarely, if ever, have an additional outbreak. But it is always in the individual who has been infected with a herpes virus, whether it's HSV1 or 2 or herpes zoster, chickenpox, and can be reactivated. The herpes simplex 1 and 2 are transmissible. The herpes simplex 2, even if there's no active visible infection, is possible to spread to a partner. Likewise with oral herpes, it's more likely if a lesion is visible in or on the mouth, but it could still be spread. Almost all of us have oral herpes. Not everybody gets the fever blisters that show up because of it. So herpes viruses do hide, and that's a slash, go dormant in nerves. These are the painful blistery lesions on genitals, but they can show up where there's been contact elsewhere on the body, in the skin or mucous membranes. They can be big, right? And you've noticed them, and they can be really tiny and not be terribly bothersome. They could be easy to miss. The treatment is acyclovir. Persons who are afflicted with herpes can take this to make sure their outbreaks are less frequent and definitely less severe, but it will not eliminate the herpes virus from their nervous system. Once again, the worst possible pictures. Human papillomavirus. We saw some papillomaviruses in the diseases of the skin. These are papillomaviruses that are more specific to the genital or anal tissues. So this is abbreviated HPV, human papillomavirus. There are dozens of different types, and there are several types that are involved in causing penile, cervical, and anal cancer because they form these lesions that are small tumors that can lead to unregulated growth and become cancerous. These are obviously some of the more extreme examples of anal warts on this side and genital warts on the other. And this is why the pap smear is done. The pap smear is looking for cervical cells that have been infected with the human papillomavirus and caused irregularities in those cells. So on the left, we have what are normal cervical epithelial cells. They've been stained blue so that we can see the edge of them, we can see the nuclei. The ones on the right have been infected with human papillomavirus, and this one is just really enormous. The cells should not be that big. These two cells are not in the active process of dividing, and yet they have two nuclei. That is an indication that there has been alteration of the DNA by the HPV infection, and that interferes with the cell cycle. That is going to interfere and lead to uncontrolled growth. And that is why Pap smears are very important to get at the recommended intervals, because the sooner this illness is caught, the less invasive and more effective the treatment can be. There is a vaccine for HPV. It contains antigens for, I think, 7 different HPV, the ones that are most commonly associated with cervical and penile cancer. And so that is why it's recommended for persons before they become sexually active, but I think now it's recommended up to age 45. It's much older than it used to be. And the hope is that if you build the antibodies to the viruses that are most likely to cause cervical, penile, or anal cancer, then if you come into contact with one of those viruses, you would be protected. It is a super common virus. Most people, if you've ever had unprotected sex, have been exposed to HPV of some sort. And most of the time, your immune system eliminates those viral particles before they can do any cell damage. But there are a few that are more aggressive, and that is why the screening for those are very important. So the viral infections of the reproductive tract, this list appears on that Chapter 23 study guide. So we've covered bacterial infections and viral infections. Now we're going to move into eukaryotes, and here we're looking at fungi. In particular, we're looking at yeast. So Candida albicans is part of the normal flora on our skin and in the vagina. It becomes a problem if it outcompetes the other microbes that are in that area. This is just showing the different reproductive structures of it. And it's very easy to see on a slide from someone who suspects they are suffering from a yeast infection. This is the mother cell, the original cell. The yeast can reproduce by mitosis, but they can also produce these germ tubes that lead to these pseudo-hyphae, these fake hyphae. Like mold have hyphae, those long, hairy, stringy projections. These aren't actually hyphae, they're just germ tubes coming off of a yeast cell. The yeast infections in vaginas happen because the bacteria that are there, or in the mouth, get suppressed. Typically, it's from antibiotics. A person might have an infection that generally does need antibiotics to eliminate it. Antibiotics, if they're oral or injected, are not really site-specific. They will go everywhere in the body. And so they will definitely take care of the pathogen for which they were prescribed, but they will also attack any related bacteria that might be part of our normal flora. So for example, someone with a bacterial urinary tract infection definitely needs antibiotics to get rid of that. But those antibiotics might eliminate too many of the bacteria also in the vagina or even in the mouth. And the normal yeast that are present there now don't have any competitors, and they overgrow. This is continuing talking about the yeast infections. The way that we suppress the overgrowth of those yeast infections is in vaginas, the lactobacilli. It's a genus of bacteria. They do fermentation and they produce acids. And that low pH is not very hospitable to high levels of the yeast. But the lactobacillus are neutrophiles to acidophiles. They really like that low pH. So this is a squamous epithelial cell from a vaginal tract. There are the perfectly normal lactobacillus bacteria. Those should be there. They are part of the normal flora. on the other side, we have the Candida albicans with their pseudohyphae, those germ tubes being put out. This was from a vaginal sample of someone who had candidiasis. And the KOH is potassium hydroxide. So the samples were taken from the patient, smeared onto a slide, and potassium hydroxide added. That essentially dissolves all of the human cells, but it won't dissolve fungal cells that are left behind. Lots of people talk about using probiotics to help with this. Probiotics, if they are ingested, probably aren't very useful. They don't survive the stomach acid, but probiotics can be inserted into the vagina. There are capsules of probiotics, and you could also use buttermilk and other fermented dairy. Little problem with that because you might not want any leftover milk hanging out there, but the lactobacilli would ferment it and make acid. But there are probiotic capsules that can be used to try to restore that balance of the lactobacillus. Treatment of yeast infections are drugs that end in azoles, the azoles. There's fluconazole, there's miconazole, there's ketoconazole, there's clotrimazole. That's a category of drugs that works against yeast. This is Trichomonas vaginalis. Persons who come down with this potentially sexually transmitted illness. It's called TRIC, which is an abbreviation of Trichomonas. It is a protist, a protozoan, so it is a eukaryotic single-celled microbe. This is a gram stain, but because this is eukaryotic, it is neither gram-positive nor gram-negative. It has no peptidoglycan. It appears gram-negative. Since there's not a thick layer of peptidoglycan, it stains pink. And there are also some bacteria in this sample that are gram-positive that have stained purple. So Trichomonas is the disease caused by Trichomonas vaginalis, and vaginal candidiasis or yeast infection is a fungus. And we've got these two will also appear on that study guide table for chapter 23.